I never met my grandfather, though I lived with him for a few weeks. By the time we moved in with him, he was already ill, far too ill to entertain visits from little girls, according to my mom. "You're not going to his room," she said, raising her eyes to meet mine in the rearview mirror. "You hear me, Ellie?" I nodded, but she continued to stare at me until I mumbled, "I promise, Mom." She held my gaze for a moment longer before looking away, turning her attention to our new home. To a born-and-bred city kid, it looked like something out of a picture book. The red brick cottage was the only house for miles around, but even in the rows of houses, it would have stood out for its door and window frames painted a cherry shade of green. Even from a distance, I could see white-winged butterflies fluttering around the honeysuckle that climbed its walls. I couldn't understand why Mom had ever left this place for our dairy 2 up, 2 down, much less why she seemed hesitant to return. We sat in the car for 5 minutes, then 10, and still she showed no signs of moving. It was mid-July, and soon it grew hot enough that I sweated through my shirt. Although I shifted in my seat, grumbling, she ignored me. Finally, my Uncle Tim, sitting next to her in the passenger seat, said, "We have to go in sooner or later, Chelly." "I have to," said Mom, quietly enough that I had to strain to hear her. "You can still walk away." He grabbed one of her hands, which had been drumming against the steering wheel, and gave a squeeze. "Not on your life." She offered him a weak smile in return before flicking a glance in my direction. "Can you?" "No problem." We piled out of the car, Mom in the lead as we headed up the garden path. She disappeared through the front door, but before I could follow her, Tim grasped my shoulders. "Come on, kiddo," he said, steering me away. "I've got something to show you." He led me around the back of the house and deeper into the garden, until we came to a ramshackle old shed. A rusted padlock held the door shut. After a few minutes of poking through the nearby shrubbery, Tim emerged with a trumpet grin and a key in his hand. "This place used to be ours. Mine and your mom's, that is," he said as he opened the door. "Now, it's yours." I didn't think too much of this gift, if that's what it was meant to be. The place looked like a stiff breeze would knock it over, and full of spiders to boot. Why would I want to spend time there when there was a cottage that looked like it would be at least in the sherry only a feet away? As I took my first flattering step inside, though, I saw that the shed contained hidden treasures. A makeshift tent constructed of what appeared to be a pair of faded velvet drapes had been erected at its center, and around it lay artifacts of my mother's childhood. There were a dozen of old board games, one of which seemed to have been abandoned mid-play, a pair of dirt-encrusted roller skates, faded comic books, and a small army of porcelain cats, all chipped and missing tails or ears. Best of all was a pile of books, with no siblings to play with, or even other kids my age on the street where I'd grown up. I'd become a bookworm. Every Christmas and birthday bought me a new book, but I devoured them quickly, and I knew my small library so well I could quote every volume. Finding new reading material was like stumbling onto a gold mine. Tim chuckled as I seized the first book within reach, plonked myself on the dusty floor, and began to read. "You like it here, then?" "I love it." I glanced up, despair and a grin. "Thank you." "Good." He smiled and thrust his hands into his pockets, looking around at his old haunt. We can make it a bit more homely for you. Bring in some lights, maybe even a portable television. He crouched in front of me, tugging the book away to ensure he had my attention. It's not going to be very nice up at the house for a while, what with your granddad being ill. Your mom's going to have a hard time of it. It might be best for you to stay out under her feet. I murmured in agreement, but I didn't need his warning. Mom had been snappy and irritable since she got the phone call saying Granddad was ill, scolding me for the least infraction, sometimes just for being in the same room as her. I'd taken to staying out of her way as much as I could. Once he was certain I understood, Tim left and went up to the house. He returned a few hours later with the lights he had promised, along with clean blankets and pillows and a bucket of cleaning supplies. Together, we worked to remove the worst of the dirt and cobwebs. By the time we finished, the shed was quite cozy. The place became my home for the summer. When I wasn't reading or inventing dramatic ways to stage the porcelain cats, I was out exploring the garden. It was there that I met a real cat, a Ginger Tom, who I swiftly named Marbling. After some persuading with my ham sandwiches, he decided he liked my company well enough and claimed the plumpless cushion in the shed as his bed. "He'll be full of fleas," Mom grumbled when I introduced her to him. "If he's planning on sticking around, he'll need a bath." I agreed, but Marbling wasn't so amenable. As soon as Mom tried to carry him into the house, he began hissing and kicking, opening several deep cuts along her arms. After clawing himself free, he retreated to a high shelf in the shed, and no amount of cajoling or bribery would persuade him down. "Fine," snarled Mom, glowering up at him. "Don't come howling at me when you're bitten half to death." As for myself, I only entered the house to use the bathroom or eat, although more often than not, Mom or Tim would bring me a plate down to the shed for me. When I did have to go inside, I got in and out as quickly as possible. It hadn't taken me long to discover that, as cheerful as the exterior was, a thick gloom lay over the house. The summer heat never seemed to penetrate its walls, and it was pervaded by a silence so heavy I was afraid to break it. As I walked through the corridors, wincing at each thundering footstep, I couldn't forget that somewhere above my head, my unknown grandfather lay dying. Part of me was curious to meet him, but another, much larger part, was too scared of his sickness and my mother's grief. I thought I saw him once, one evening around the sunset. As I was leaving the bathroom, I caught movement at the far end of the corridor. I leaned forward, squinting. I noticed that the shadows here had a peculiar density, particularly as the sun went down, and I wasn't sure whether my eyes were playing tricks on me. Although I spotted no more movement, a patch of shadows was darker than the rest, and I had the unshakable feeling of being watched. I knew it wasn't Mom or Tim. They were both quick to shoo me out of the house when they spotted me indoors. "Granddad?" I whispered. A moment of silence, and then there came a low, rattling exhale that sent a prickle of goosebumps along my arms. As young as I was, I knew that no one could breathe like that and still live. It sounded as though they were drowning on dry land. I knew I should have helped my granddad back to bed, or at the very least call for my mom, but that breath was too much for me. Throwing my hands over my eyes, I ran for the door and didn't stop until I had reached the safety of my shed. Once I had calmed down, I was overwhelmed by a burning shame. I had run from an old, dying man without a second thought. The books were waiting for me though, and it wasn't easy enough to lose myself in one of them. By the time I fell asleep, I'd all but forgotten about the incident and didn't think about my granddad again until I saw them carrying his coffin out of the house. I expected his death to spell the end of my time in the shed, that Mom and Tim would insist on me moving into the house now that he passed. The funeral came and went, and they made no mention of it. I kept quiet. I had transformed the shed into my own little realm, and had no desire to leave it. Shortly after, I began attending the local school, and neither of them complained about our living arrangements. It was only the arrival of autumn and the first of the cold weather that forced the issue. "We'd love for you to stay out there," said Tim gently as he helped me move my things into one of the bedrooms, "but you'll catch your death of cold." I nodded, fighting back an unexpected wave of tears. I knew he was right. The last few mornings I'd woken up with toes so cold that they'd hurt. Still, I'd miss what had been my home for the last few weeks, and worst of all, I'd spend less time with Marmalade. I'd grown used to his warm little body curled up against mine at night, but he still refused to enter the house. In the event, the house provided more protection against the cold. I spent my first night in my new bed shivering around a hot water bottle, slipping in and out of an uneasy sleep. The next day, I yawned my way through school, hoping that exhaustion would at least guarantee me a good sleep that night. Despite my hopes, I fared no better the second night than on the first. I kept my bedside lamp on, for its glow provided at least a semblance of warmth. Or so I told myself. Now that I was back here, there was no pretending that I had imagined a strange quality of shadows. When I turned the light off, the darkness seemed to press in on me, making it difficult to draw a breath. Even when the light was on, I was revisited by the feeling of being watched. Several times each night, I would clamber out of my bed and do a circuit around the room, sweeping my arms beneath the bed, pulling my clothes aside in the wardrobe and peering out of the window. I performed all these late-night searches trembling and sweating, the latter in spite of the cold. I desperately wanted to wake Mom and ask her to look for me, but her mood had sunk even lower since Granddad's death, and I was scared of waking her. I never found any signs of an intruder, yet each time I was on the verge of sleep, I would snap back to wakefulness, certain someone was nearby. This continued for a week, until my body could no longer bear the strain. I crawled into bed that night and within seconds had lapsed into the state of being sleeping and waking where dreams and reality are all but distinguishable. And as my awareness ebbed and flowed, the light winked out. I couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes. I didn't need to. I could feel the darkness pressing down on me. It swelled around my throat, rushing up my face and sweeping into my mouth, my nose. It clogged my airways, choking my breath. The pressure on my lungs became unbearable. Just when I thought I must breathe or die, two things happened at once. There came a great, rattling breath, both inside my body and out of it, just like I had heard that evening before my granddad had died. It was met by yowling and a searing pain across my chest. The choking presence retreated. My paralysis was broken. I fumbled through the defeating darkness, barely hearing the inhuman shrieks that bounced around the room, desperate for light. Finally, my trembling fingers found the lamp. As light flooded the room, silence fell. At the bottom of the bed, I saw Marmalade, my sweet, brave cat, limp but breathing. Scooping him up in my arms, I fled the house. Only when I reached the shed and slammed the door shut behind me I did give away to tears. They came as heaving sobs rasping out of a tender throat. Mom and Tim appeared soon after. "I'm not going back in there." I tried to shout, but it emerged as a croak. "I won't do it. You can't make me." They exchanged an unbreakable look before Tim turned and, without a word, went back to the house. Mom gathered me in her arms, murmuring soothing nonsense against the top of my head. I was terrified that she would ask me what happened, but that she wouldn't believe me. But she had held me. Tim reappeared with an armful of thick blankets, which he fastened into a bed on the floor. "This will do for night," he said. "We'll get you something more permanent tomorrow." They stayed with me until I fell asleep, and were gone by the time I woke next morning. True to his word, Tim went into the nearby town and bought me a heavy-duty sleeping bag. It didn't quite keep the chill out, but anything was better than sleeping in that house. Nothing was ever said about that night. No questions asked about why I had fled and refused to return. That didn't sit right with me. Before we had came to this place, Mom had been attentive. Every night she would ask me about school, who I had eaten lunch with, what subject I had enjoyed the most that day. She was at every parent's evening, quizzing the teachers about the smallest detail on my latest report. That she would not ask a single question about what had sent me screaming from the house didn't just seem wrong. In the sanctuary of my shed, the memory of that light became little more than a bad dream. My one source of misery was Marbeline. Although he had physically recovered from whatever happened in the dark, he wasn't the same cat. He no longer waited at the gate for me to return from school, ready to butt his head against my legs. He no longer seemed interested in me at all, approaching only to snatch scraps of food before retreating to prowl the boundary of garden. A few days after I returned to the shed, I found him next to the gate, lifeless. Blood had trickled from his ears and eyes, staining his bright orange fur a rusty brown. After Mom and Tim buried him in the garden, they came to my shed to comfort me as I cried. Eventually, I sobbed myself to sleep. By the time I woke, darkness had fallen and Mom and Tim were talking in low voices. "We need something stronger," said Mom. "That's if we're right at all," murmured Tim. "There's only one way to find out. Besides, what choice do we have?" I heard shifting, then gentle fingers brushed across my forehead. "Should we really be discussing this right here?" Mom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Would you rather discuss it in there?" There followed a silence that lasted so long I began to drift back to sleep. By the time Tim spoke again, I could no longer be sure whether I was awake or dreaming. "Okay," he said. "Let's try." I hope you guys enjoyed this story for today. Now, thank you all for listening. Big thanks to the Redditor u/nemmoph for this amazing story for today. For full credit, I will link the Reddit user down below, and you guys should check them out. So, thank you guys a lot for watching. Now, don't forget to sit back, relax, and indulge in fear.